Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to GlobeSpan 24/7. Here we have GlobeSpan is expanding, engaging, embracing, and educating our communities right here in New York, across the Caribbean, the UK, and all other parts of our globe. So this creates the platform for the 3Ds: the dialogue, the debate, and discussion. And many of you have seen some of the programs we've had over the last couple of months. Recently, we've had the CCJ event that took place live the last couple of days on GlobeSpan. So we want to thank you for tuning in and allowing us to raise the bar with the GlobeSpan programs. But before we continue, I want to ask everyone, when you, as you're tuning in live with us on GlobeSpan 24/7, please click like and share the page on Facebook. Also, if you can go to the YouTube, we also have the YouTube live. You can check that one out. For some of you that might not be able to tune in on Facebook, see if you can share that as well for some people to help them to log in. So I hope that you will continue to join us and allow us to expand the discussion, the debate, and the dialogue that we are bringing to you live right here on Facebook at GlobeSpan in New York. As we continue, let me just say today's topic is an important one, and as we choose the topics we share with you and our audience on Facebook, on YouTube, and in audience, we try to bring the subject matters that are important to our communities. And today, choosing this particular topic that we have, the conversations on race in Guyana, and the journey to healing, is extremely important, not just to me, but to all of us here. And these individuals that I will introduce you to, we've actually had conversations, and I've had conversations with people in our audience and some of you who are tuning in with us live, how important this is and to move our nation and our people forward. So today, as we open the doorway to healing for our people of Guyana, our nation, and our audience, those of you tuning in studio and online, I want to welcome you back again to GlobeSpan 24/7. And don't forget, on the 19th, May 19th, we'll be moving from the Saturday to Sunday the 19th. So hopefully more people will be able to tune in with that. So on today's Let the Woman Speak episode, again, we have conversations on race in Guyana, journey to healing. So embracing 4 individuals here in studio that will engage our audience in the first GlobeSpan Courageous Conversations, telling the stories as they were told in our history over time, and some coming from learning from our ancestors. So I want to welcome Alexis Stevens, who is sitting next to me on my right. Next to her is Patia Singh. And then we have Ferlin Pedro. Did I say that right? Yes. Ferlin? And Anton Craigwell. So let me just share a little highlights of these folks that are joining us. Alexis Stevens is actually visiting us from Guyana. I want to thank her for joining us today in bringing a very important topic to the conversation. Alexis, just for an update, is a member of the Sisters of Mercy Institute-led anti-racism and training team since 2009. She's also commissioner on the Caribbean, Central American, South American Anti-Racism Commission. Her work is focused specifically on designing, organizing, and facilitating anti-racism training workshops in Guyana, Argentina, Panama, and the United States of America. The Sister of Mercies of America is an international community of Roman Catholic women. The CCASA is one of the 6 communities that makes up the Sisters of Mercies of America. And as I say that, you'll get to hear from Alexis in terms of how some of that work translates to what she does in Guyana and across the globe. So next to her, we have the Patia Singh, who is the founding director of Rajkumari Culture Center. For those of you living in New York who is aware of the Rajkumari Culture Center, that has a long history with New York. And I just want to share a bit about Patia. Has pioneered and institutioned several programs critical to the Indo-Caribbean community she serves and the wider New York environment. As director of the Rajkumari, she utilizes all her skills, knowledge, and experience to create a vibrant cultural and artistic organization that continues to be the vanguard of cultural renaissance to revive and revitalize Indo-Caribbean art and culture, and to preserve, present, and institutionalize these arts here in the United States. And this just goes to show you how important, even in the arts, that can transform to the conversation on race in Guyana. So we'll hear from Tia about that. Also, we have, this is not just let the women speak, the men will speak as well. So we have a very important person in my space, my partner and good friend, Anton Craigwell, who is the founder and president and CEO of DBGM. He actually comes with a background from journalism, and there's so much on him, but I'm going to just highlight, if you don't mind, Anton, you can fill in what I miss out, right? Is that okay? Okay. He actually produced a documentary, You're Not Alone, and actually the documentary has been traveling across the US and other parts of the Caribbean, and facilitates discussions on depression on Black gay men. In 2013, he founded DGBM, a nonprofit organization committed to raising awareness of the underlying factors contributing to depression and suicidal ideation in Black gay men, including contracting HIV. And DGBM is an organization based here in New York. Anton is also a certified national mental health first aid instructor. And hopefully we'll be able to get him to do a mental health piece in the upcoming episodes. He also hosts a In Mind conference, a mental health conference that it's been 3 years? 5 years. 5 years now. I was fortunate to attend one of them in New York, and it's actually coming up again in October. So if any of you are interested, we will share that in a future episode of when that is scheduled. But you can find DGBM on Facebook and follow some of the work that they're doing. Ferlin, our handsome young man here, Ferlin is a postgraduate student in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. He's a frequent public commentator on politics and human rights issues in Guyana, and you could follow him on his Facebook page as well. And that's what caught my attention in inviting him as part of this conversation here today. He hopes to inspire and change the prevailing ethnic-centered discourse in Guyana in favor of a more inclusive approach through solidarity and understanding. And I believe, Ferlin, you have a blog also, right? So you'll tell us about the blog so people could follow that as well. So each individual comes in with a framework. These are their opinions. So we will share that with you, and we will open the conversation. And as we open the conversation, I'm asking that we include an open dialogue within those of you who are tuning in at your homes, you know, on your phones, in your cars, wherever you're at, in our studio. Open the dialogue, because this is a very important and critical conversation, especially as Guyana approaches election, whether it's coming in the coming months or 2020. So I want for us to keep that in mind and encourage our children as well as this conversation continues. So tomorrow we all know that it's Mother's Day, and it's celebrated tomorrow. So as we celebrate Mother's Day tomorrow, I was actually thinking that if we all can lift up our female ancestors who journeyed with their partners and spouses to Guyana from Africa and India and parts of India, let's show them that today, despite their struggles, we honor them in spirit. I dedicate this episode today to our ancestors, our mothers, our mother's mother, her mother, and so on. I also dedicate today for a little girl, my niece, Shavana, who is not here right now. I think she's on her way. I wanted her to hear the stories of where our ancestors come from, and hopefully let the stories impact the adult that she will become. So to all the little girls out there and mothers, celebrating Mother's Day, please take the time to maybe, if not share some of this, to include that conversation and encouraging them, especially the children who are born here from Guyanese parentage. And so they know the stories, because so many of us have missed some of that stories. So as we continue, I'm just going to go around and ask each of our guests to kind of like highlight, about this particular topic and coming here today. What does it mean to you?
Well, I think it's a timely conversation. I often say that the conversation around race is what I call a courageous conversation for those people who are really willing to enter into this conversation. I say it's courageous because there is a tendency in Guyana to downplay our racial differences. Too often, you'll hear people say, oh, we don't have a race problem, it only surfaces at election time. My own position on that is, if it surfaces at election time, it means that we do have a race problem. So it's the willingness to begin, first of all, by acknowledging that we do have a race problem. The willingness to engage in a conversation around how we got here, but more importantly, what can we do as we look towards the future? What are the lessons and the strategies that we can give our children? And I say our children because, when we think of our parents, when we think of our grandparents, they're more or less set in their ways. The children, to me, represent our greatest hope for this transformation that we want to see. And so that's why, I want us to be able to bring children into this conversation. So it's about what are the strategies we can give our children or young people to begin to address and, as I say, disrupt this narrative around race and the superiority of one racial group over another. Oh dear.
It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. I was really thinking about what I would speak about and how I would like to go forward in this circle is not to talk about, I know where I came from. Everybody knows I came from Guyana. I came from a rich culture. I'm a 5th or 6th generation East Indian from Bihar and part Nepalese. We had a lot of interactions about 5-6 generations ago between Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, and so on. And today, of course, we're English speaking. Many of us in our at my age, and so we've lost our language. We cannot even speak Hindi, really. These are some of the things that the treasures, not just how we dance or costume ourselves, but the language. We've lost the language, and I think that's really a big thing that we a part of us that's lost, right? And I think, but we could still go forward with new generations, instead of them doing mathematics again, which they do in school for so many hours, we could just get them involved in more things that are historical, artistic, things like this, where young people or intergenerational are like much more than just young people, where we can, learn and teach and, pass on, also energetically, right? The heart. Let's say the heart, our hearts, right, could come together, and I'm very excited about that. And I really don't want to talk too much about this, but I would just like to read this, which was written by my mother, Rajkumari Singh, and Par Aji is great-great-grandmother. Par Aji, my great-great-grandmother. In my dreams I visualize thy dark eyes, peering to penetrate the misty haze, veiling the coast of Guyana. Knewest thou then it was to land, far flung from home? Thy bark the seas had skimmed, bearing thee thy kismet to fulfill of sweat and toil? Paraji, did bangled ankles well thy sea legs bare, while sahibs gaze thy exotic gazelle beauty of face and form envelop? If later thy chastity he violated, 'tis no shame to thee if man turned brute a lotus soul defiles. Paraji, if thou could see thou offspring steeped in thy philosophy to bend before the tempest's blasts.
Thank you so much. Farley?
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing. Well, thank you, GlobeSpan, Diane, for having me on this very important topic. I think I should begin by acknowledging Alex's proposal that we need to confront this very important topic, which is race and racism. I think it's one of the troubling things about my own experience growing up in Guyana is, well, first, not being aware of exactly what racism truly means. And I say this because from a very young age, my parents, we moved to several towns and villages, and it was a very mixed community. It wasn't one predominant ethnic group that populated the community. And there are several communities and villages in Guyana that you can go and see this sort of diversity in the community. And I think that's very important to be a part of such a community, to truly grasp what it means to be part of an inclusive and diverse society. But when we moved several times, and when we moved to certain communities and villages which did have concentrated ethnic groups, predominantly you would see Indo-Guyanese, or predominantly you would see Afro-Guyanese. That's when things started to change. My perspective started to change on what I'm in the midst of, and that was largely fueled by what my neighbors, relatives, friends, and family, what they saw and what they related to me at a very young age. Now, I'm not pure Indo-Guyanese. I don't have a pure Indo-Guyanese heritage. My mom's side has can probably claim that. My father's side, he's a mixed individual, but his father was well, he's still alive. He's Portuguese, European heritage. My grandma being a mixed individual, half Amerindian, half Indo-Guyanese. But it's very interesting, the mixture of my my own family, and being in the communities that I described initially, that I had no perception, no conception actually of what racism means or what difference means. And I think as I age and I reach my late teens, having graduated from high school and becoming more aware of the political reality of Guyana, I think that's when this ideology of racism really got to me, and I started to see my society very differently. Of course, I'm sure many of you listening would know what I'm talking about, especially when it comes to politics. And I hope we eventually get to explore this dimension, the political dimension of racism, because I think that's the dimension that I somehow fixated myself to try to understand the roots, the causes, why is it continuing in such a very catastrophic level. And sometimes it's very worrying to me because it impacts how I relate with my friends who are of a particular race or racial identity, or who belong to a particular ethnic group, and it also affects how they see me, especially when I have characteristics that might not be considered to be likable within their ethnic group or racial space. And so there, on the one hand, there's the group identity aspect to racism that I'm very interested in, and on the other hand, there's the aspect of how do we get beyond that? How do we reach a level of equality and even equity, economic equity, if we're going to look forward to a prosperous, transformative Guyana. So that's the portion that I hope to contribute in this segment.
Thank you, Ferlin.
Thank you very much, Ferlin. Preeta, Alexis, thank you very much, Diane, for having me on this conversation, and to GlobeSpan24x7 to be here as well. I'm particularly concerned about the issue of race in Guyana. How, as a social construct, it has contributed to the destabilization and undermine the good qualities that exists in all of us. Priya, you talked about it. Alexis, you talked about it. That in Guyana, for example, there is that we only hear about race when elections comes up, but within in the remaining 4.5 years, it lies dormant. People get along. People interact. People share foods. They share weddings. They share music. They share dress. They enjoy each other's company. But then comes election, and the divisions start to manifest. They start to be played upon. Let's remember, go back to the 2015 election, when certain members of one party were going to Wim village and starting up Apanjat and race issues. And we can remember that there was rioting in Linden, and several people were killed on the Wisma Bridge. Okay? But Alexis, you made an interesting allusion just now when you talked about that racism only surfaces around elections to divide. Because for the 4.5 years, people were getting along. It lay there dormant. It lay there maybe festering, but at the same time accommodating. But consider the origins of racism. And this is where I am particularly interested in, is the origins of how racism has played into Guyana culture and politics, and at the same time contributed compoundingly to affect the mental health of both blacks and Indians in Guyana. And I want, if we have the opportunity, to talk about the historical origins of that, of where racism came to be a factor in Guyana, where it is a real, livable, real, actual thing that happens. And we talked on one of our conversations before this about where do we see ourselves going, where does Guyana see itself going in the future, in the 21st century, with a lot of younger people, millennials. And I think what we need to do, and we have the saying in Guyana, well, not just in Guyana, but you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But I actually do believe that changing the language, changing the conversation, we can help all the Guyanese to understand with information and education how they came to be believing some of the things that they do. And then the younger generation will be able to say, well, all right, I understand where they're coming from, I understand the historical context, but this is not my reality today. And I need to forge a new reality that is more inclusive and embracing.
Anton, thank you so much, because that leads into what I wanted to bring up and correct that earlier, before we started this conversation today, we did have a conversations ourselves. I either had individual conversations with you all, or we had a group conversation. So, but before I jump to that part, I want to remind our viewers tuning in, we have telephone numbers as we're going to make this conversation today interactive. I'd like to see this more interactive than our other programs. So even though you're not in audience, please use the USA number for those within the United States, 718-555-3290. Devin, can we hit up the numbers? Canada, 647-557-6200. Guyana, 225-9054. Trinidad, 653-9195. So you should be able to see the numbers scrolling on our screen. So if you see the numbers, please give us a call. Be part of this conversation. So if you didn't have an opportunity to be here in audience, let's have that conversation and expand it in a manner of where we can make it a teachable moment and increase the knowledge and grow what the knowledge of our ancestors have taught us. And again, GlobeSpan24x7 reminder, we will be moving. Today's our last Saturday, running the program on Saturday. Next Sunday, we'll be moving Sunday the 19th, starting at 12:30. So on that note, so again, Anton, thank you so much. And based on the conversations we've had, so one of the questions I want to ask, and Richard, who is in our audience, Richard sent me a really good article by Rajiv Mahabir. And he had posed something in the article that I want to present to you all. And let's see how we can create that dialogue in here, addressing what you said, Anton, going back to that part. Has the legacy of our ancestors erased like for Indians coming in, the Indian Arrival Day, or Emancipation Day, because we just had Indian Arrival Day May 5th, right? Emancipation Day is August 1st. So if we're looking back historically and where we came from, has the legacy that we've experienced erased some of that? And, actually with celebrating, these major events?
I think,
yeah. Anyone?
I think that,
Yes.
oh, thank you. I think that the cliquish history that we have between races, especially many of our people lived on plantations and were isolated, actually. So, a lot of them didn't have a lot of African people there and other, Portuguese or any other race, unless it's the white man who was the overseer, right? But the thing is that we have broke down many, many barriers in Guyana against this. And I meet a lot of my nieces and nephews, some of them great nieces and nephews, and they're really cool with that, and they have friends who are multicultural, multiracial, and they get along very well together. There are times within my own family, there was an incident where my sister-in-law did not want her son to marry a mixed man, right?
Yeah.
And she didn't, and she married an Indian boy, right? And she has twins now. It's all happening now. And she can't stand her husband, and he's just not. Are we looking for the right race or the right person? That's really the personal question that we need to put out there too, because we have feelings, and we all have a heart, so we all have emotions, and we got to use our emotions to bring us closer together, and to really be real about it. Yeah.
Right. Anton, how about you, since you raised this?
I know. Sometimes I should probably keep quiet, right? When I was talking just now during my introduction, one of the things that speaks to our ancestors' influence on our thought processes today and how we deal with race comes from the perspective of the colonialists. The British process of divide and conquer that it is true separating and pitting one race against the other, where it is making one race or one set of people seem more superior and the other inferior, that we begin to destabilize and undermine the very existence of each person, the very value. So consider this, that for the blacks who were brought from Africa, they were shipped as cargo. They were shipped as property. The Indians were brought under fraud, false pretenses. They were brought as indentured laborers with a promise that they would be repatriated with with X number amount of money. But in the process, the British had no intentions of really honoring the value or seeing the value of the Indians and the blacks as humans. They saw them as just products for labor. But what is interesting is that today we still perpetuate that colonialism. Because when we talk about racial divisions in Guyana, we are still perpetuating the divisiveness that the British and the Dutch, before the British, set up and use as a means of control. I think what we need to talk about, and we talked about this on one of our calls, is that going forward, we talked about the construct of who writes history. So yes, we've got Rajiv, who's a dear friend of mine. We've also got Gayatri Bahadur, who's written about Indians coming to Guyana. But we've had Walter Rodney. We've had Eric Williams from Trinidad. We've had President Granger right now, who's a historian, who's written about history in Guyana. But each historian writes from the perspective of their own race through that lens. And the history books that we've had in Guyana are often written and published in England. The history books that I learned back in high school were written and published in England. So who edited those books? Let's take, for example, that in the United States right now, it is being revealed that the Bible, there were two versions of the Bible. One version of the Bible that was for the whites, and another version of the Bible that was used for the blacks. And in that version of the Bible, passages and scripture was removed that would have encouraged or given the black slaves opportunities to rise up and rebel. So what is to say then that the history books that we have today, or that we were exposed to as children in schools, were written in such a way to continue to keep us down?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pick up on that. And but no, it's not a rejection of what you said. I actually agree with most of it. The only part that sorry about that. The only part that I have an issue with when it comes to the history books, and you rightfully said that we have many Guyanese historians and authors who've written terrific works. I've explored some myself, and politicians and independent historians, or even academics who become politicians. One of the interesting thing about history is that it's supposed to tell us a unifying narrative that is supposed to be derived from a collective series of perspectives, and that collective series of perspectives should corroborate each other, not necessarily collaborate. And that's where your concern, I believe, comes in, because when you have, let's say, several Indo-Guyanese writing a particular segment of Guyanese history, you might get this feeling, and I guess it's based on the sentimental feeling that you get from reading their work, that there's a sort of collaboration in effect, and it's sort of prejudiced, it's sort of filtered. You don't really get the emphasis or the emotional emphasis as you would, let's say, read from an Afro-Guyanese author such as Walter Rodney, who's very passionate in his literature, that speaks on behalf of Afro-Guyanese in society, and before the society was even a society. And we're talking about plantation days, and so that much I get. I think we still have to be careful how we construct that narrative of filtered history, though. And I think it's really and truly a collective effort to make that sort of distinction between good history, bad history, prejudiced history, or a non-prejudiced history. And but we can only do it collectively, where you bring one part of the history, and I'll bring one part of the history, and we compare and contrast. However, one thing I want to come back to, which was raised, I think it was a matter of generations. The older generation having a very strident, almost staunch-like belief about what happened in the past, and a lot of them who've lived through that past. And I'm going to just say it out and confront it, like specifically the Burnham era, the Forbes Burnham, who was the former president of Guyana for several years, almost 3 decades. I hear a lot of stories about those times, and I think, well, naturally being is because that's the generation that I'm confronted with. That's the generation that I live with, people who came directly from that generation, and the feeling that you get when people relate about that particular moment in Guyanese history, political history, is it can be very dark, it could be very brutish, and it could also be very divisive. And I think it's the latter part that I'm more concerned with, because history as it is, it'll tell us whether cruelty really happened. You have your records, the historical records that you can survey, but it's the divisiveness that I'm more bothered by, because what the older generation typically wants to do is impose that divisive rhetoric onto the present. And I think there should be an important distinction between what happened in the past and what is actually happening right now. I mean, if you look at the 2015 campaign leading up to the coalition government winning the elections, President Gridge was accused of being just like Burnham, right? And he publicly declared that he's not Burnham. And but it's the sort of rhetoric that you get that has a deeper ethnic racialized aspect to it. It's not just Forbes Burnham the person, it's also Forbes Burnham the Afro-Guyanese, who led government for approximately almost 3 decades, but under very some would describe it as dark circumstances, but nevertheless it was very trying circumstances. So I think there's a generational discrepancy. The young generation, the old generation. The young generation wants to move on, people like myself, but not necessarily move on to say we neglect the past, but to say that old generation, what can we learn from you guys so that we don't make the mistakes that you did, that you committed to. So I guess that's what I wanted to share in that regard.
And Alexis?
So if I could maybe start with the last point you made, Ferlin, which is about the older generation trying to pass that divisiveness on to us. I think is really what is central to this conversation. I have come to believe through my work in teaching about and training people about how to unlearn racism or how to disrupt racism, is first of all to begin to understand, because you have to contextualize things, and the context in which we operated then and the context in which we operate now has to be considered. And the truth of the matter is that when we talk about Guyana, we talk about a nation that was birthed from colonialism. Colonialism itself is based on this construct of race. yes, race is a social construct, but it's a construct that has been weaponized. And it has been used, as we have seen, pre-1966, to divide communities. And I think it's interesting that usually when we talk about race in Guyana, we talk about the two main ethnic groups. But the truth of the matter is that racism operates at every level of our society. And I like to say that maybe our pathology as a country is that race is the prism through which we see every single thing, through which all of our relationships are constructed. So if you look at our political institutions, our political parties, you look at our, socio-economic issues, if you look at our socio-cultural issues, all of these things are affected by race. Now, if this nation was birthed from colonialism, and then your colonial masters left, and Guyanese assumed leadership of this nation, what was done to change the structures that were put in place to help the plantations and to help the colonial powers to be able to function? So what changed when we moved into independence? What changed was that we assumed leadership of a country, but did we do anything to dismantle the structures that were already in place that has contributed to the problems that we continue to see today? And so this is where this whole argument about systemic racism has to start. That unless we dismantle the structures that continue to give rise to the problems that we're seeing on the ground, then it's really going to be hard to make changes. And I also want to say that, when I enter into this conversation on race, I talk about two things. I talk about personal prejudices, because we all have them. And I also talk about structural racism or systemic racism. So that we have to talk about both of these things. Because very often, people with personal prejudices move into spaces where they acquire power, and then what happens? That racism becomes systemic. It continues to be weaponized. And so these are the things that we have to pay attention to. That's why I think that, I want to be able to change the generation that came before us. But I feel in some ways that the damage has already been done, and that our only hope really is to begin to do this work with young people. And I was happy when you said that, that when you talk to your younger family, these are people who are willing to see beyond all of the characteristics that have been used to separate us in the past. So it's about skin color, it's about hair texture. But having said that, I also want to acknowledge that what still continues to happen is that in many homes, people are having conversations about not bringing certain people into the family. Right now, you have people who are saying to their parents, who are saying to their children, don't bring this kind of man into this family because, or don't bring this kind of woman into the family because. So, as much as we want to say that that we've had some changes, and I agree that, we've had some changes, there is still a lot of work that remains to be done. And that if we don't begin to do the work of helping people to see how their own personal prejudices impact how they relate with people of other groups, then, we're going to be doing this dance for a long time to come.
One of the important things that, in New York at least, I've seen bring Guyanese of different ethnic communities is in Brooklyn. when the Caribbean organizations have a party or they have a kwekwe or they do something, and but not the problem is that the information is not being trickled down to the villages, let's say Richmond Hill, Bronx, right? I mean, the new generation, her generation, definitely his generation. I mean, they're not dealing with this stuff, right? I mean, we've lived it. We've been through a lot of hurt all the way around, and we're still carrying that, right? And I'm reading this poem by my mother about our grandmother that came from India. And then, there's another little, two more before it closes, I'll read it. What happens after that, What happens when you're on the plantation, both for Africans and Indians? Because up until yesterday, they were still raping, the white men were still raping Indian women and black women, and things like this. So, it's, and then of course, they just left the country when it hit the fan, right? They could just fly out to, Portugal or wherever they came from, China and so on, right? Canada. But the thing is, we're still here, and even now that we're here in New York, and we're creating little Guyana, big Guyana, medium Guyana, we're still very Guyanese culturally. With food, we're very Guyanese. We're very gracious. We were taught in schools to be gracious. We used to wear socks and shoes and things like this, a little tie and a hat and so on. So we understand order, and we all could come to order, and we are in order. That's all I've got to say.
I think we have a question coming in. Devin, yes.
Yes, we have
caller. You can go ahead.
We have some comments from online. On Facebook, Everton Tanner says, "Race hate is taught from home. It's a cultural thing and false pride." Bantu Babu says, "Such an important topic. Thanks, Diane, for this topic." From YouTube, we have Joy Agnes who says, "I'm loving this topic. I wish that one day we can be one." And Delight says, in response to that, a good wish.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for comments coming in. We appreciate that. And again, just a reminder, we're moving next week to Sundays, starting at 12:30. So make sure you keep your dial tuned in. So Anton, okay, I'm sorry, Ferlin. Yes.
Briefly say that the user who said, "I wish one day we can be one." That's a very interesting sentiment, because when I read the history books, I look at the period as Alex has described, the pre-1966 era, pre-independence. Is this working? Yeah, I see a very interesting segment in our history, where the politics is concerned, and I don't know how many of you know, but the history of arguably the most popular political party in Guyana, the People's Progressive Party, now Civic. I mean, back in the early 1950s, the People's Progressive Party was a political party founded by not just one individual, but two individuals, Forbes Burnham and Chedi Jagan. And the interesting thing about this is very symbolic to me, as well as I internalize it, is that here we have a period before independence where we were unified under one cause, and that cause was ultimately to overcome imperialism, British imperialism specifically. There was no racialized politics. There was no, you black, you coolie, or anything like that. I don't see any trace of that in the history books. I don't see any trace of it even in the books produced by the British statesmen. They never describe an ethnic dispute that we have manifested today. And but what we saw was an Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, the two majoritarian ethnic groups, coming together, joining forces to ultimately defeat the I would describe them as the former, right? And then things just fell apart after this period. And it fell apart because I don't think it fell apart because of race, particularly. I actually think it fell apart because of merely an ideological dispute between Burnham and Jagan, and that's it. And however, I think that I'm not gonna lay blame on either of the two founding fathers of the nation, but I'm gonna just say that I think part of the blame, at least, should be laid on them with respect to how their politics unfolded thereon. And when I look at the People's Progressive Party today, and I look at the People's National Congress today, both political parties are still ethnic-centric, largely the case. And this is something that they do not acknowledge. They do not accept that we are ethnically segregated from each other, right? And I think the politics is what really fuels and plays into the momentum of racism in Guyana, and why it is very stubborn to combat, because we have political leaders who are not acknowledging the obvious. The elephant in the room is there is clear racial segregation in your political parties, and you need to do something about it. And this brings me back, I'm going to just make this very brief, it brings me back to the introduction of proportional representation, which is the political model that Guyana's democracy is framed under. And the purpose of that model is to ensure that each member of society, each group, each individual have the opportunity, in terms of ideology or ethnic interests or cultural interests, to be part of the political dimension. They all have a contributory aspect or role to play in this proportional representation. However, what we saw was the contrary. We saw a concentration of ethnic groups coalescing, joining forces in isolated political campaigns, and that's what we still have largely today. Despite the coalition government's efforts, we still have the PNCR being predominantly Afro-Guyanese. We still have the PPPC predominantly Indo-Guyanese, and I think this is a very important component in addressing this racism that we're talking about.
Could I just say something? After the 1963, when we had the big riots and the burning of Georgetown, and people were throwing bombs into, families, homes were burnt down with, like the Abrams, with their 13 children, mother and father, and all of a sudden it's about communism and, what else? Capitalism. But the thing is that we have never not been able to come together as a nation up to now. And what's happening here? People are leaving Berbice every day to come to Richmond Hill. They're just leaving the country. So you really wonder what's happening in Guyana. Who's and you still got the PNC, you got the PPP. There's no new parties. Where are all the young people with all the PhDs and their master's degrees? I mean, what are they doing to help Guyana? Why must we Kuli people go back to Guyana and crawl around there waiting for a grain of rice when we could be lolling off in really, we really got to think of ourselves. And the way we speak about Guyana's history is always like some textbook, right? But that's for like white people or people, foreigners. We know the textbook because we know it because we lived it and we are living it and we are here and we didn't give up our identity. We still being Kuli and we still being black and we still doing Kwekwe and we still doing everything in Brooklyn. Anybody get 25 cents, they get a flight and they go to Guyana. They're not going to Belgium or Russia or Czechoslovakia or London, right? They're going back to Guyana to see the Mati, right? All the way around. So really, it's a racial problem that still exists in the country because of the politicians, right? And it's not even about socialism, communism, or capitalism. It's just they need to have two parties. Why does a country have to have two parties? Maybe they'll have to have a king if they didn't have that or something. But it's so absurd that the poor people are being whipped constantly. You know, those of us who could get out by ship or boat or plane, it's great. But the majority of people can't. And then the children that come up here, as soon as they get over here, you know, before express, they want to just throw away that identity. They don't want to. They don't identify. And bring your Madrasi for the puja. You know what I'm saying? In Burmese. So that's really about what's our wealth.
But the diaspora has an equal role to play as well. You have like well over 700,000 Guyanese abroad who are indeed digging into the doubles in Brooklyn and enjoying the kwekwe in Brooklyn.
Yes, Brooklyn.
Right?
What about Guyana?
Exactly. What about Guyana? Where they came from? The diaspora has an equal role to play, and this is why I only moved here 3 years ago, and it's
Speculating. The people in Guyana, all races, they just want to leave the country, right? And what's happening is all these retired doctors and you know, people with money, they're going down and buying up the forest in Guyana, building ranches and raising cows and doing things, and coming back here to do their doctorate, right? So, you know, you need to go and speak to all these business people in the avenue and find out what are they doing? What are they doing here? What are they doing for Guyana? All the Kuli people, all the black people coming in to see them, right? So they're getting everything, but they're not. What is Guyana getting? They're not getting any of the.
so you're not disagreeing that the diaspora has an equal role to play in that the diaspora.
There are a lot of people I know here who are doing that,
Right.
including myself. I use that. I run an arts organization. I'm a writer. I'm a playwright. I'm a dramatist. I'm a community member. I would take this little girl who never made a step and I would turn her into a dancer. But the point is our culture. Keeping our cultural things alive, our history, our this, whether you're African, whether you're Chinese, this and that and the other, you know? So it's really about holding on to the history, and if it wasn't written by African slaves who couldn't write or Kuli people who couldn't write, we are the ones that have to write it now.
All right, in the interest of time, let's just, because we're going to have to wrap up shortly, so let's just go to Alexis and then Anton. And then I want to catch Richard Singh in our audience, because he had made some great points in our conversation that we had as a group. Alexis.
So there are a number of things there are a number of things that I would probably want to respond to, but time doesn't permit me to do that. But I want to say two things. One, that it is about communism, it is about capitalism, and it is about socialism. Two, I want to say that when people leave Guyana and they move to other spaces, we see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this U.S. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
I know, yeah.
So that to me really says that, you know, I think in some ways we give lip service to this notion that we don't have a race problem. And there's a bit of, and that we're being disingenuous when we say that, because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade unions, we see it in the places where people work, in the occupations that certain groups of people take up. We see it in what happens when people leave Guyana, where they choose to settle. You know, all of those things really are informed by the fact that we are mired in all kinds of racial problems.
Would you say that it's a natural instinct to do that? You know, among species?
So that's
Let me say the question, ask the question. Would you say that that's a natural instinct among species to sort of, you know, be in a barn together?
So that's a conversation that requires more time, and I know that we have to.
That it's an issue, but meaning in terms of cultural.
And so I don't want to say no, and I don't want to say yes, because I would really like to be able to elaborate.
Okay.
But I know that
You did highlight that we are prejudicial by nature, but
Yeah.
you know, that's a discourse by itself.
I just want to say one little thing. I mean, I understand because I've been there. I'm here too, and I'm there. I perform with some of the greatest artists from the Caribbean in Brooklyn, Ron Bob Semple, and then, by the way, he has a movie out. And, you know, this is the interaction. I think working with Africans and, you know, other people in dance forms, art forms, and so on, I feel really empowered. You know, I feel I can walk forward alone into the sea. I don't need anyone behind me because I've got the bundle, you know? And that's something that I try to pass on to my students and all the little ones, to my family. It was handed down to us in that way. It's yours. The earth is our richness. Thank you.
All right, let's, again, I so apologize to our viewers tuning in. And, okay, and so let's just get, engage our audience here also. Richard, I know part of the conversation that you had with us. Richard?
Yeah.
Yes. Can you mention, and because you also had touched on even the article that you shared with me, with Rajiv, and you mentioned something about the psychosocial impact of the post-colonialism. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. What I love about the article, I think it draws a lot of parallel with Guyana, where we came from, and you guys did a very good job of illustrating that. So, because of the interest of time, I'm just going to hit on one aspect of it. The globalization, what we are facing now, comes from our past. The colonialism, the apparatus for colonialism still do exist in today, and what is happening today in Guyana, as you guys rightfully mentioned. And it is such a complex thing because there's not a lot of research that is being done, in my opinion, and following this topic. So we're not able to identify exactly what are the key indicator or the key primary indicator factors that contribute to the state of our country. But you guys mentioned a lot. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say to you guys are doing a very good job in having this courageous conversation, and it's going to take more than one episode. And you guys are bringing the factors and the instruments that are pulling or plucking out from our history, where we were, where we are, and where we need to go. Colonel West said the condition, I can't remember the exact phrase, but what Colonel West actually said, is an American philosopher, is that the condition for the suffering is all about giving the person the opportunity to express their suffering and to get that out from here. And that's what you guys are basically doing. And we in the audience here, and also through YouTube and so forth, are getting a touch and a feel of that, because we're going back into our own personal history and identifying, as you mentioned. I would love to hear you spoke more about the mental health aspect, because that's an area that I love, and that's something that I'm very passionate about. And one thing that I would say, well, actually is a question I would like to ask you guys, because of the interest of time, is based on all your conversation here, how can we use the Me Too movement that has transcended from what the Me Too movement actually originally began in 2006 to address the topic that you guys are discussing? I have many questions, but I'll just try to basically ask that one, and if time permit me, there's another one. Well, Alexis, I love what you said. The construct of what the colonial masters and the empire has put in place, that is a conversation I would love to explore, and hope that the panel can explore later on, because it's a very important one that leads back to the construct of what you're saying, Antoine, in terms of the mental health construct. So what I'm trying to say is, there are parts of all of you guys' conversation that is bringing together an image or a canvas of a picture that is becoming very vivid, and continue to do what you're doing. Dialogue, discussion, and continue to do that. So just to repeat back, the Me Too movement, how can the Me Too movement affect change with regards to the topic that we're discussing in Guyana, and what is it that we need to do to have the Me Too movement a part of this discussion?
Why don't we pass that to Anton? Oh.
Thank you very much for that question.
And then after Anton, let's jump to someone from our studio audience who had a question. I apologize. You can go.
Thank you again for that question. I think appropriating the Me Too movement or the Me Too hashtag and applying that to the Guyanese context, we can probably even change it to say, Me Too, I too am a victim of colonialism. And because one of the things we talked about when that comes up consistently is how colonialism has affected us. And just to jump back to a couple of points that came up that some of you guys were talking about is to consider that for assimilation and adaptation for survival, that each of the racial demographics in Guyana conformed to the white standard. So consequently, even by our simple use of good morning and good evening, our simple use of the clothes and the way we dress, so how many of us still have good clothes that we don't wear except on special occasions, because when we go out, we want to represent and show we are the best. Because ultimately we wanted to be able to impress the white owners, the white in superior positions, because we want to be able to secure better economic prospects and futures for ourselves and for our children. Consider, back in the days of after slavery, in Victoria Village or Buxton or Belfield, how many blacks changed their names to suit the plantation owner or the plantation themselves? Yeah. How many Indians sacrificed and sublimated, suppressed their religious belief to become Christian, to go to a Catholic school so they can get the education to be able to rise up? And I'm glad you made mention about how many Indians and people are leaving Guyana, because that also comes with a form of displacement or disassociative flight. I don't want to be here. I never wanted to be here. I was brought here to labor. I was lied to, and I've been forced to remain here, but I don't really want to be here. And so when we talk about mental health, and again about suicidal ideation, in 2014, Guyana had one of the highest rates of suicides in the world at 44% of the population. But watch this. Interestingly, in Guyana, disproportionately, there were more women who were taking their lives than men. And disproportionately, the suicides were concentrated among the Indians more than the blacks. So there has already been built into the Indians by generation, I don't want to be here. There's no reason for me to continue to remain here. I need to leave. And if I can't leave by jumping on a flight from and I'm still going to call it to marry, okay? If I'm going to jump on a flight, then I am confined to staying here. I am forced to remain here, and the only way out is some Malashan or some carbon pills.
Can I say one little thing to Anthony? Sure. You know, it's true that we have to be patient also, but you know, our lifetime is just only so short. But I do see changes. But my nieces and nephews, which is now the next generation, they have no interest in Hinduism. They have no interest in Islam, right? But they're all marching out. They're all Hindus, come from Hindu families, and but they all became Christians. Now, from a Hindu perspective, that's a huge loss, right? If all your nieces and nephews have embraced Christianity, you know, we used to have my grandmother had 30 grandchildren, right? 30 grandchildren, and in our generation, we hardly have 3. Okay, and it's 8 children my mother had. I just want to show you where the population is. It's not here either. Yeah.
All right, so let's we have a studio audience that I believe have a comment or a statement.
Oh, yeah.
Question.
Yeah, I'm Banmati Ram.
Hi, Banmati.
And what I like to say is that whereas we've heard like concepts, we've looked at history of slavery, of racism, where it's coming from, or probably.
Can you hold the mic a little closer, please?
Yes, we've heard about, we've listened to the panelists. And what I've not heard so much of is where do we go from there? Some of the solutions or some of those things. And I grew up in Guyana many moons ago. And I actually went to, I'm from an Indian community mostly, 99% when I grew up. And I went to church in Golden Grove. So I was forced to interact with people of another ethnic group. But what was good about interacting is that my father had neighbors that he grew up with, and when they passed through the street, they would say, he would call them neighbor. Neighbor, come and sit, and because they grew up as boys together. And then we went to a black church, and my chacha said to him, why are you letting your daughter go into a black church? And my father had to face those kinds of opposition, but because we were so many kids in the home and we went, my father saw us living, a good life, and he did not object to it. But we ourselves had to face interacting with students in Golden Grove, students in high school. So we learned how to, and then I went to Jamaica, and I'm an ordained Baptist minister. And I was the only Indian pastor, only Indian person in 3 congregations. I was pastoring, and it didn't matter. They saw me as pastor. First, they saw me as a woman pastor, and then they saw me as well as an Indian, and then they just saw me as pastor because I interacted. And if you're willing to interact with people of another race and to walk amongst them and to go to their functions and to eat. But one thing I realized when I was going to Golden Grove Baptist Church, I never spoke politics with the people, with my sisters and brothers, who were mostly of the other race. And I happened to speak politics to one of them when the coalition was coming into power. And I was part of the coalition movement as well. And when I started to critique the coalition when they were not doing as well as they should, somebody got mad at me, and the person was from Golden Grove Baptist Church of another race. So the other issue we need to maybe think about is that you might be in the same congregation with people of other ethnic group, but you're not talking about issues that affect you and that are like sores there. You don't want to touch it because it's going to cause a lot of pain. And so I'm glad for this conversation, and it's the young people and us who have, been around older people who will have to move this conversation forward. Because even when I went back to work with government on contract, when I walked into the Ministry of Education, people saw me as an Indian Guyanese and a PPP supporter, because Indian means PPP supporter. And they weren't sure how to take me. So when I walked in the office, I said, I am Guyanese, and I'm here for all Guyanese, irrespective of ethnic background, color, whatever you call it. And these are the things we have to confront in the ministries of government, in ministries in Guyana. It's not easy, but if you want to go and work there, you will have to go.
Thank you, Banmati, so much. And I'm glad you raised that point. So we're going to close this now by saying, and I'm going to ask each person, is it okay for just 1 minute for each person? Yes. So 1 minute, guys, right? So I apologize to our viewers. I know this conversation is so extensive, and we can talk so much more about it. Remember, this is only part 1. So we will be looking at other parts of this conversation and how we can expand it. And as Banmati asked, and we all have mentioned, the way forward. So here's to all on our panel. And I'm going to throw this out to you, but again, my apologies in the interest of time. Just keep it brief. We all have had a story to tell. And growing up in Guyana, we've seen and heard the stories, whether it's from the history books or our ancestors. So if we had a chance to rewrite those stories, can you tell one thing from our past that you would change? Anton, why don't we start with you?
I have to think about that a little carefully.
Okay. Ferlin, would you?
It- proposal.
Can I ask for you
Sure.
particularly?
Okay.
I have, and you and I talked about this coming from a mixed race. I have my 8-year-old niece sitting in the audience right now who is of a mixed race, and I had this conversation. She is looking shocked. During her school break, she was at my home, and we had this conversation about, she said she's of her black parentage,
Okay.
but her father is Indian. So talk about that. If we had to rewrite the story to teach my 8-year-old niece and other children that might be out there, especially for young people coming from a mixed race, like what would you rewrite? So my 8-year-old niece could grow up to be a well-rounded adult like you. You know what I mean?
Try my best. It's such a responsibility. I think during our discussion, I think I said I wouldn't change anything about that history. Of course, there's always the ideal, and the question of whether we can reach the ideal or not it's a matter up to dispute. But I think there wouldn't even be a conception of an ideal were it not the case that we had a particular history be the way it was, so that we can learn from it, derive lessons from it, and so that we can create a very interesting, more progressive future. So I wouldn't rewrite Guyanese history. I wish I had the power to, but I wouldn't rewrite it because of what happened and the consequences that led to those events. But I think those events are really giving us the capacity to show the world on a large scale that we can actually make diversity and inclusion work. We can actually set the stage for something as complex to become a matter of just simple yesterday's problem. So.
All right, so they're telling us we have to wrap up, so I'm going to ask Alexis, touching it very briefly, Pritia and Antoine, so we can close off.
So I want to say again that the struggle that your niece is facing and the struggle that all people of mixed heritage face is that they're forced to choose one race over the other, not by choice, but because of what our society tells them. And so in thinking about the question, what do we do? I don't want to say that we should just focus on education, because education alone is not going to solve our problem. Each of us must be intentional in terms of how we talk about people of another race, in terms of what we say to our children, in terms of what we say when people say negative things about people. So it's, your father, being forced to respond to people asking why you're sending your children to this church. It's a child forcing to choose between, whether she's Indian or whether she's black. So it's, all of us must be intentional in addressing our prejudices, and we must be intentional in terms of saying and acting in non-racist ways.
All right, thank you, Alexis. Let's go to Anton. Let's give Anton, and then we'll come back to.
I think
and just close off here.
that being able to change something from my past in terms of understanding race is going back to about 1978, I think. Actually, no, before 1975, when there was a referendum between the PPP and the PNC, the cup versus the palm tree, and my mother saying to me not to go to the Indians' house today and play, because that may not be the best place to go today, because there was an election, there was voting, and it was again along racial lines. My mother was PNC, and the family across from us was PPP, and then being able to understand that in different communities like Ferlin, perhaps, I am mixed race, and not being accepted by the Indians for being Indian, and not being accepted by the blacks for being black. I'm not black enough. So there's still in the black family part of me that says I'm still half skull, and like a dose, I'm still Indian. And as a child growing up, I never liked sitting with my feet hanging down. I always prefer to cross my legs, and I prefer to eat in my hands without even realizing that I had Indian ancestry. And then on the Indian side, I was too black to be Indian. So I never really fit in. And so the question again is, going forward, how many young people of mixed race don't find a sense of belonging in either racial grouping, but then now have to create their own? And that sense of not belonging creates another form of mental health destabilization.
Just real quick, and then we'll close.
I just want to say thank you for this, and it's definitely a narrative that needs to continue. Those of us who are in the diaspora, but personally, I mean, I feel so lucky to be born in Guyana and to go to the Methodist Church, the temple, the masjid, you know, everything. We just did everything. We went everywhere. And we had aunts who were Christian, and we had great aunts who were this and that, and we were just there. And then we lived on the plantation during the riots around Diamond there, just to be safe. And we started learn how to walk barefoot, pick up cow dung, and make dal bottom house and things like this. But you know, that's what we should do with our children: send them out to learn, and get in touch with the country. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank our guest, Alexis Stevens, for coming from Guyana and taking the time out from her schedule to join us. I appreciate it, Alexis. And Alexis is celebrating a birthday tomorrow, so I want to wish her a happy birthday. And it's really wonderful meeting her. Peter, I came to your home and had the story and getting that experience. Thank you so much for embracing me and sharing all that knowledge with me. And I know you have a wealth of knowledge to tell us. Ferlin, coming from, I'm not going to say youth perspective, but being the youngest of the group, thank you so much for joining us and bringing that to the forefront. And Anton, as always, thank you again. There's so much to this conversation, and we will continue on a part 2. Date not known yet, but keep in mind, as of next week, we are moving from Saturday to what, folks? Sunday the 19th. So please tune in. Stay tuned. At 2 p.m., we're coming up with our political segment on, I believe, the CCJ. So stay tuned for that. Go ahead.
We just have one final comment from an in-house audience member. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And we have a lot of great comments from online, but unfortunately, we are out of time.
All right. So again, thank you. Stay tuned for the 2 p.m. segment.